I've been reading comics for about 3 years. Sure, when I was a little kid, I read a little bit here and there, but it wasn't until 2022, after watching Matt Reeves and Robert Pattinson's Batman film, that I found myself truly enamored by the medium. I remember being at a local comic shop with my girlfriend right after watching the film and stumbling across the Long Halloween Batman comic, and I decided to pick it up on a whim. From that moment forward, I became almost uncontrollably consumed by comics. I love it all. DC, Marvel, Image, independent comics. I don't really care, man. I just think comic books as a medium are beautiful and stunning and have the ability to communicate their stories in ways that I don't really see in other pieces of media. But during my 3-year journey of comic book consumption, I've learned that comic books are a very intimidating and sometimes downright unapproachable medium, especially DC and Marvel comics. Let me explain. When I embarked on my comic journey, I decided Batman was my guy. I wanted to read all the hits, and one story that kept popping up in different lists online was Batman by Grant Morrison. Prior to reading this book, I had some knowledge of Grant Morrison, but not much. And based on what people online were saying, Batman by Grant Morrison was a story that relied heavily on pulling from the fabric of pre-existing DC continuity. On top of that, Grant Morrison's Batman was connected to another DC Crisis event known as Final Crisis. So already, in order to read Batman by Grant Morrison, I had to read the Batman Omnibus Volume 1, take a pause, read Final Crisis by Grant Morrison, and then read the other two Batman Omnis. Okay, not too bad. But then I'm doing some research and I realized that Final Crisis apparently is a convoluted story that's super reliant on the reader having some form of pre-existing knowledge about DC Crisis events. Okay, so in order to read Grant Morrison's Batman, I have to read Final Crisis, but in order to read Final Crisis, I need to read more DC Crisis events? Okay, so I look up DC Crisis events, and let's see. I have Crisis on Infinite Earths, something called 0 Hour Crisis in Time, Identity Crisis, and Infinite Crisis. Oh wait, but according to people online, you should probably read 7 Soldiers right before Final Crisis, and then read 52 after Infinite Crisis, but also prioritize Morrison's other work like JLA to probably contextualize who these DC characters are. And you gotta read Animal Man before reading 52 because Morrison's Animal Man plays a big role in 52. And there's just a bunch of other comics you gotta read before you read 52 because 52 has a long-lasting legacy that's connected to DC Comics, and oh my god, it's so much. So now, all of a sudden, in order to understand Final Crisis, which I need to read in order to understand Grant Morrison's Batman, I have to read Crisis on Infinite Earths, 0 Hour, JLA by Grant Morrison, Identity Crisis, Infinite Crisis, 52, 7 Soldiers, and then and only then do I have enough context to appreciate Final Crisis. All of this so I can just read a Batman run that people say is really good. As an outside comic fan looking in, you're probably looking at this list and thinking, what the hell, this is completely ridiculous. And you know what? You're right. But that didn't stop me from reading all of these books, because I wanted to holistically appreciate the sprawling landscape that is DC Comics. And honestly, I hated most of them. Crisis on Infinite Earths was a boring, expositionally dense read with a seemingly impossible to follow cast of characters. This book has all of this action, but it still manages to make the stakes feel meaningless, in my opinion. I just did not like Crisis on Infinite Earths. In fact, I hated it. Grant Morrison's JLA was great. I liked that a lot, actually. Identity Crisis was a offensively gratuitous story that focused on using the sexual exploitation of a female character to push its story forward in a way that was, quite frankly, really dumb. I hated Identity Crisis. Infinite Crisis starts out really strong, but it just didn't do anything for me by the end. I really didn't care for the world-ending, time-imploding threat. It just felt like nothing special to me. 7 Soldiers was a little underwhelming. I don't know, it was a little disjointed and confusing, and you get the idea. For some reason, I subjected myself to this robust reading order just to dislike most of the books I had to read. And here's the kicker. None of these books were really that important in the first place. While these stories do add a little bit of context to Final Crisis, Final Crisis is a book that in itself is going to confuse you either way. You need a PhD in DC Comics history to truly understand Final Crisis. And I did all of this just to read a Batman book that, quite frankly, exists in its own little pocket of the DC universe. While these stories do a really great job at mythologizing important concepts, they don't drastically elevate or negate the brevity of Morrison's Batman. I read all of these books for absolutely no reason. So when people say comics are inaccessible, I get it. I've been there. I fell down the rabbit hole and got too lost in the DC continuity sauce. But guess guess what? You don't have to do what I did. A lot of folks will tell you continuity is important. Read this book for context, blah, 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 blah. But the truth is, you just gotta read what you love, man. Marvel and DC Comics have been around for over 80 years. It's gonna be impossible to know everything. And I think a lot of people find comics daunting because there's no definitive starting or stopping point. It's not like manga where you pick up the first volume and you're good to go. Both DC and Marvel comics are an ongoing thing. And while they've had their handful of continuity resets and new reader onboarding points, you just have to take a step back and view DC and Marvel comics as a never-ending soap opera. Think about it as a soap opera that has 30 seasons already out. But you don't have to watch all of those 30 seasons. You can literally hop on during some random episode and just enjoy, because each episode exists as its own thing. What I'd suggest doing is identifying writers or characters you like and follow those stories. And if you don't know what's going on and you are a little bit confused, don't feel pressured to read older books. Just Google it. I wish I did that instead of forcing myself to read books I didn't like.
That's not to say there isn't any benefit in reading older books to fill in those context gaps.
For example, Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars is a comic book event that people absolutely adore. This book is so popular, Marvel is making its own movie inspired by this book and also an 80s series. Now, a lot of people are super hyped about Secret Wars and want to read the comic book. You can read the Secret Wars comic book event and enjoy it, but you can also read Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four and Jonathan Hickman's Avengers to get a little bit more context before reading the Secret Wars event, and you'll enjoy it even more. Regardless, if you want to read Secret Wars, you can read it with these books or you can read it without these books, and you can enjoy it either way.
At the end of the day, you should just prioritizing reading books that you want to read. Don't feel pressured to fill in context gaps unless you want to read that context. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. What's important is that you read books that you enjoy.
Comic books can be daunting. There's so much to read and learn, and at times they feel downright unapproachable in the way that you basically have homework assignments to do in order to fully understand continuity. But listen, embrace the fact that it's a never-ending mythos. It is virtually impossible to read absolutely everything, and that's kind of part of the fun. If you're confused, look on Google for answers, but most importantly, read what you love. There's plenty of great stories out there right now waiting for you. And if you guys want to buy some comic books for a really great discount, including graphic novels, collected editions, omnibus editions, Organic Price Books is the place to go. They sell collected edition comic books for up to 50% discounts, and you can use code YooHoo on checkout to support the channel and get a little bit of a discount when you order. But yeah, that's the video. I hope you guys have enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching.